Hello, welcome everyone. This is Angie with Ohana Investment Partners, and I am joined here today by three partners and people I have met honestly through online networking and developed a relationship with. So if networking online is not something you're doing, I highly recommend it. I connected with Andrew a little while ago, and he has introduced me to some more of his colleagues in his network. And so I wanted to bring them on today because today we are talking about entitlement. So as part of the webinar series through Ohana Investment Partners, the goal is to bring you education on real estate investing every couple weeks and to provide you with value and additional information so that you can evaluate offerings and opportunities as they come about. So these three people really specialize in entitlement. They have a lot of experience in entitlement. And so we'll be walking through what the heck entitlement is and why it may be a really great addition to your investment portfolio. So before we get started, I just want to introduce the people that have been so kind to join us today. So we'll start with Andrew. Andrew Brewer is a commercial operator and developer who brings years of experience and a lot of facets. He is the managing partner at Irongal Investments. And prior to starting Irongal Investments, Andrew has a successful career as a stationary engineer. He, as an engineer, he oversaw operations in high-rise commercial facilities valued individually over 200 million. So there's a lot of experience there. And then we'll jump over to Gil Mishulla. And so Gil is the managing partner at Hyperion Investment Group. He is a qualified real estate finance professional with years of reputable experience underwriting over $2 billion, and that's billion with a B, $2 billion in single asset, multi-asset, and portfolio transactions. Gil has an acute understanding of real estate economics, underwriting credit, and real estate transactions. And last but not least, we have Vivi Nguyen with us. Vivi Nguyen is a real estate investor, and she is focused on residential, multifamily, and ground-up development. She's acted in various roles as an owner, a transactions manager, and operator at several real estate investment companies in the Austin area over the past 6 years. She's overseen the acquisition, rehab, and disposition of over 3,500 apartment units. So that being said, we're going to admit a couple people in, okay? And then we'll go ahead and get started. So you should be able to see my screen, and we're going to keep this really conversational. So the agenda is basically to walk through real estate entitlement and what it is. And so we'll walk through some general information, and then Andrew, Gil, and Vivi, if you have anything you want to interject, please, by all means, just interject. You don't need to wait. And then at the end of the general information presentation, I'll turn it over to Gil, and Gil has shared with us a case study. So he'll walk through an entitlement case study so we can dive a little bit deeper into entitlement and what that may mean in terms of an investment. So with that being said, we'll go ahead and get started. All right, so real estate entitlement. Real estate entitlement is changing what the land can be used for via zoning. It's determining what specifically will go on the land and things like building design, materials, height, overall appearance, and interior design. One second, sorry, for some reason, bear with me, sorry. There we go. Now I can advance it. My mouse was not cooperating with me. Okay. So this is what is entitlement continued. Making sure any potential projects adhere to local codes. Local codes look at things like safety, access, drainage, flood mitigation, and parking. And all of this combines to make sure that the communities are safe and pleasant for residents. So that's what they're looking for. And then designing and selecting on-site amenities or connecting to existing trails, existing parks, or other public improvements. Again, this goes back to ensuring that communities are safe and pleasant, right? Because as residents, that's what we're looking for. Some examples of real estate entitlements are subdivision maps, approved tentative and final maps, architectural design approval, grading permits, and tree removal relocation permits. Do any of the three of you want to touch on any of these examples, kind of a high level?
Yeah, I can touch on all of them. You know, for a subdivision map, sometimes that's also called a plat. You may have a preliminary plat and a final plat, and essentially what that shows is not necessarily a subdivision per se, although it might specifically be a subdivision, but it will essentially outline the placement of buildings, you know, what size those building pads will be. It'll outline things like parking, where various amenities are going to be placed, where the roads within a community are going to be, if it's a larger community, where entrances and exits will be, where drainage will be, and all those types of things that would be outlined on the ground. Essentially, when you're reviewing a plat, it's like you're looking at the site from an aerial view, but not like a photo. It's like an aerial view of what eventually will be on the site. And in doing that, you need to make sure that everything on that plat or subdivision map adheres to local codes. So you have things like, you know, setbacks and you know, minimum roadway widths and requirements, you know, for things like fire access, making sure that, you know, emergency vehicles can navigate the site. You have to take all of that into account when you're designing your subdivision map or your plat map. Architectural design approval generally is the next step after you have a plat, and in that you'll have your building pads that are outlined on your plat map or your subdivision map, and then the architect will use that base and those dimensions and create a building that can fit into that space. Generally, your architect will want to work with your civil engineer to make sure that they can design the building that you want to see there with the rough dimensions that the civil engineer has given. And the civil engineer will want to make sure that when they're conducting things like soil studies and when they're designing those building pads, outlining things like select fill or anything that might need to go in, that those building pads can support the weight of whatever building you're going to put on there. You know, if you're putting a one-story building, that's not going to weigh as much or be as big of a deal. But if you're putting, you know, a 20-story skyscraper onto a site, you know, you're going to have to make sure that the ground underneath it can support that. You know, and that's where things like soil studies and things like that come in. For grading permits, that has to do more with the slope of the site. You want to make sure that, you know, you've properly accounted for structural engineering to account for grading, because, you know, if your site is sloped pretty heavily, usually over a 15% grade, you start to have more expensive structural engineering work that needs to go into a project, which can increase your cost a lot. So, you know, if anyone's ever seen, you know, photos of houses, you know, built into cliffs in, you know, places like California, you know, you see like somebody's mansion kind of, you know, overseeing the ocean on some really steep cliff face. There's a lot of structural engineering that has to go into that. And a lot of that comes back to the grading on the site. Something like a cliff is going to be, you know, really steep grade, but, you know, you will have sites that, you know, have less of a grade, but, you know, you still have to engineer around that. So that's a very important part of it, because your costs can skyrocket very quickly if you're not paying attention to that. And then tree removal and relocation is a bigger deal in some areas than in other areas around the country. I'm located in Austin, Texas, and, you know, in the Austin and San Antonio areas, tree removal and relocation is a big deal. You know, usually you have to have an arborist come out and survey all of the trees on a given site. You know, so they'll go and they'll take notes of what species of tree is there, what the size of those trees are, and generally trees with a trunk diameter that's over a certain size, you know, maybe it's, you know, 10 inches or 20 inches, will be classified as a protected or a heritage tree, especially if those trees are of a specific species. Here in Texas, things like cedar trees generally are not considered to be protected, but things like heritage oaks or heritage elms will be. And if you want to remove a protected or a heritage tree within a protected species, generally there is a fee that you need to pay or some kind of mitigation that you need to put into effect, whether that's, planting more trees somewhere else on your site, or whether that's, paying a fee in lieu to the city so that they can go and plant trees on public ground, like, maybe in a park somewhere or on some, land that the city owns. But that tends to be a big deal here in Texas, and it's more strict or less strict in other parts of the country. It's very location dependent.
I know in Florida it gets a little strict as well, some areas. So. Okay, and some more examples are building permits, utility connection permits, and sewage disposal system permits if a septic system is required.
Yeah, building permits are the permits that you get after your designs are approved. So, if you're doing a plat map or a subdivision map, or, trying to get your architectural designs through, you'll complete those documents, you will submit them with a formal application to, the city or the county or whoever the governing municipality is for your project, and they'll review them and typically send them back with some comments, and you address the comments and work through that with the city. And once the city approves your plans and says, like, yes, these plans that you've submitted do conform to our codes and ordinances, they'll issue you a permit, which you will then pay for. And once you have that permit, you can actually start doing physical improvements for the thing that you want. Like, until you have that building permit, you can't, go and start, doing anything on your site. You can't roll trucks in, you can't start, pouring foundations or cutting down trees or anything. It's only after you get that permit. So that permit's very important. Utility connection permits tie into that. Generally, there's a couple parts to that. One scenario would be if there are already utility connections that run right up to your site that are of appropriate size to service your development, then you're simply paying to connect to those existing utilities. That would be what we would call a tap fee or a meter fee. And that's, essentially you are buying a tap or like a water meter, or an electric meter or whatever utility that you're trying to tie into from the city, and they install it and connect the piping and utility lines that you've run in your site. And then that's how the city is able to track the amount of utilities, the utility capacity you're using, very similar to, like the gas meter or the water meter at your house that the city reads and then gives you your bill based off of. If you don't have utilities that are running to your site, generally you will have to negotiate to improve what they call off-site utilities, which are utilities that are not on your site, they are off your site, but you may have to improve those utilities in order to get service at your site. So for example, if a city or a municipality, says, hey, you're going to be building, say 200 apartment units on this site, and in order to get water service to those 200 units with enough capacity and water pressure and everything to service that, you're going to need a 10-inch water line. And as the city, we only have a 6-inch water line available and not enough capacity. You as the developer might have to go to the city and say, okay, we will pay to upsize your city line so that we can have capacity to do our project. Sometimes there's a negotiation there with the city, perhaps the city will pay for part of it, and maybe you as the developer pay for another part of it, or, that becomes much more of a tricky negotiation there. And that's one of the big wild cards in development, is trying to figure out the offsite utility cost, because cities are always forward looking. They want to improve their lines at, developers' expense, because, they need more capacity as cities continue to grow. And sometimes, they'll be a little aggressive. Sometimes they'll be kind of nice. I've personally done projects where, the city's been very nice and just, said, hey, we'll just, have you upsize whatever utility lines to the size that you need to service only your development, and that's going to be the most minimal cost. I've also had projects where the city came and said, well, in order for us to let you do your project, we want you to do not only the improvements that are needed for your site, but also a bunch of additional improvements so that we can start servicing other developments that are, I guess, as they would say, downstream in their maps from yours. So that's kind of a tricky thing, but there are permits that go along with that. You have to get permits to do those improvements. And that's a negotiation process.
So it sounds like there's so much like back and forth negotiation, right, between the city, whatever architects you're using as well, right, attorneys and whatnot. There's a lot of back and forth and negotiation, and at the end of the day, collaboration, right, because everyone has to be on the same page.
Yeah, it's really a team effort.
Yeah, with all of these things, there's a lot that goes into it. Do you find that, I know, the three of you have done multiple entitlement projects. Do you find that once you find maybe a city or an area that's a little more negotiable or easier to work with, do you find that you're doing, multiple projects in that area just to streamline it, or does that come into play at all?
It's definitely preferable because, cities are not some, separate, monolithic entity, right? It's just a gathering of a bunch of different people that live usually within that city. And, they're people, they're individuals, they have their own viewpoints, what they want to see. And so once you start to know people within a city, you get to know, city council members, city planners, city engineers, all those folks, you kind of get an understanding for, how they lean, what they want to see, what they're going to be looking for in your submissions, what some of their, touch points might be as you work through a process. And having that kind of in-depth knowledge of an area can be invaluable, especially if it's a city or an area where it's more of a complicated process. There are some municipalities that are really easy to work with and they don't really care, what you're doing one way or another. There are some that are, kind of sticky. They want to see their city growing in a particular way. They want to see specific things going into their city. They have a development plan in mind that they really want to strictly follow. Maybe they don't want to see some of a particular asset, and knowing how cities are leaning there can be valuable, because the last thing you want to do as a developer is just go out and, buy a piece of land and say, oh, I'm going to go and, develop whatever it is I want to develop on here and close on that piece of land and get investor money in and, kind of start down this road, and then go to the city and find out they're like, oh, well, we actually don't want to see that kind of project here. Then you're really in trouble. You want to make sure that you're addressing all of those questions ahead of time. You want to be really transparent with the city. There's no point in, hiding anything from them or holding anything back, because those things will all come out later. It's a collaboration. You're dealing with so many people and they're going to be looking at your plans so in depth that you may as well tell them exactly what you're thinking, what you're going to try to do up front, and identify if they're going to have any problems with it at all.
No, that's, yeah, I know we were talking about kind of offline, right, mitigating risks with entitlement, and that's part of it, right? It's just being very upfront with, this is the project, here's our intention, what is your feedback? So before approval is provided for entitlements, obviously supporting documentation is required to verify that the land is suitable for the improvements. Some of the specific steps that are taken, obviously, as Andrew was walking us through it, it does sound very involved. It is. There's in-depth site studies and analysis, including ordering and analyzing third-party reports with including environmental assessment, utility assessments, drainage, soil surveys, topography, and tree mitigation. In addition, you're looking at site planning to determining the building size, right? And placement of buildings, adherence to codes around parking. I know in Florida, parking is a big thing that people working on entitlement projects kind of get stuck on or have to work with, right? So around parking, setbacks, drainage, and incorporating existing features of the land and modifying the land itself. Drafting of civil engineering documents and calculations for drainage, flow of water, placement of utility lines and building pads are all part of the process. And then, oops, sorry, I went backwards. I did not mean to go backwards. And then obviously drafting of architectural documents for building design is important. Drafting of mechanical, engineering, plumbing, structural, fire mitigation. I feel like the list goes on and on and on, right? So it sounds like entitlement would be really easy, right? You just buy a piece of land and you get it entitled, and this is what we want to do, right? But it's really, it is very involved. It is a very intensive process. And, you know, obviously you all know what you're doing. You have the experience. You have to know what you're doing or be working with someone that knows what they're doing. Design of offsite utility improvements, submission and revision of all above documents, and stamped approval, right? That's like the end goal, stamped approval. And then payment of any fees or public required bonds for maintenance and performance of offsite utilities. And I know you touched on that a little bit. So before we get into the case study, because the case study is next, but so why may entitlements be a good addition to your investment portfolio? And I'll ask you guys your opinions as well, or what you've seen. But at the end of the day, if you're looking at builders or developers, they like entitled land, right? They want to build and develop. So we walk through a lot of the steps that have to happen to make the land shovel ready. So builders and developers want to come in and they want land that's shovel ready. And quite frankly, they're willing to pay the premium for that. So they don't have what they see in their mind as a headache, right? They don't have to jump through all these hoops. They don't have to take the 12 to 18 months, and you guys can talk about time frame in a little bit, but they don't have to take that time to get the project entitled. They're there, right? With their, in my mind, I'm a very visual person. They're there with their hard hats and their shovels and they're ready to go, right? I realize they're not shoveling, but they're ready to build. So do you, either Gil or Vivi, have any feedback, or Andrew, on another reason why it may be a good investment?
Go ahead, Gil.
Yeah, I mean, look, besides that, it's I understand people will have a concern about cash flow, right? It's a very different type of play where you're not seeing cash flow coming up front. But what we're doing is, as long as you have, in my eyes, the right partners and you have the best experience, I almost look at it as a bond. It's really a checklist at the end of the day. And as long as you work with the city, you work with the architects, you work with the civil engineers, you are really, there's not much to really worry about, because these players are doing everything you're supposed to be doing. And also by buying land, and since there's usually nothing there, you're able to get it at a much cheaper entry point, thus also mitigating your risk. And also when you're able to then bring it to entitlement and having it fully permitted, again, like you were saying before, you get that premium. So that premium is, another plus that makes it a more lucrative investment, because you got to think about where all the players are. You want to have a different niche than most players. A lot of players are right now doing the value add. A lot of players are doing development. They're doing these single family portfolios.